welcome to our second session of the Triton Talks webinar series. We'll be hearing about part of the Triton Initiative's Environmental Monitoring Field Trials campaign today from Kate Buenau. She'll be diving into the availability of models for estimating environmental effects and how integrating monitoring and modeling strengthens the planning and evaluation of marine energy projects. So on the next slide, we'll just go a little bit over some logistical notes for attendees. We are using a Zoom webinar setup and have muted you to ensure that there are no interruptions during the presentation. So if you do have any questions that come up, feel free to put them into the chat and then I'll read them during the Q&A session that's after the presentation. We'll also be including helpful links to resources and relevant articles in the chat, so keep your eye out for those. We'll be including links to our Triton website, some stories, and a lot of other fun stuff. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on YouTube along with the rest of the webinars in the series. So if you would like to reference it again or share it with others, or maybe view a webinar that you missed, make sure to check there and we'll have them posted. On our next slide, we'll talk a little bit about our presenter. So Kate Buenau is a quantitative ecologist specializing in modeling the effects of human activities on aquatic habitats and species and management to conserve and restore habitat. She received her PhD in ecology from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and she joined PNNL in 2009. She's worked with the Triton program since 2019, evaluating modeling approaches to environmental effects of marine energy. Kate works in our beautiful coastal region on the Olympic Peninsula at the Sequim campus, which sits right on Sequim Bay. And you can see that here, just so you have some context for her work. And with that, I'll let Kate take over and talk about her research.
Thanks, Nolani. So I'm talking about predictive models today, and predictive models are a really good way to understand both positive and negative effects of human activities on the environment. But actually being able to apply these models to real-world situations beyond research requires advances in modeling theory and background research, and also requires access to the types of information that you would need to set up models and to validate them in the field. In a paper published this January in Journal Marine Science and Engineering, I, along with Isabel Garavelli, Linnea Kemmery, and Gabriel Garcia Medina, reviewed modeling approaches for environmental effects of marine renewable energy. And we were trying to find out what's available, what are the common data needs and how that relates to monitoring, and how can we streamline the process of modeling and monitoring to make it more accessible to planners and regulators and use it to help facilitate marine energy development in general. So using predictive models is a really good way to synthesize what we do and don't know and identify those gaps in our understanding. And it's really the best way to quantify things that our brains can't quite determine on their own, even if we have a good knowledge of the system. And sometimes this is the best use of models when there's a lot of uncertainty, is just knowing what you do and don't know and what that means for your decisions. In a planning process, you can explore different scenarios and compare, say, different project sightings or designs. And you don't even need perfect models to do this. You can use this models at various levels to provide you information about the relative difference between these scenarios. You can use them to estimate the probability of various outcomes occurring. And so that could be used to help meet thresholds or criteria for management or for the planning process. You can also use models to enable you to measure one thing in the field and estimate another metric that might be a lot harder to monitor. So just relationships between different metrics that can fill in some of your information gaps. They help when relating effects across scales. So if you're trying to get from an experimental scale to broader implementation of a marine energy device. And it's always really important to keep track of uncertainty in the models. And you can use that, besides knowing where you are right now, you can use that to watch the uncertainty levels change over time as you learn and as changes may occur to the environment. And why is this important for marine energy? As we know, there's not a lot of operating devices out there yet to monitor, and there especially aren't arrays of devices to monitor. So there's some major information gaps. We also probably all know that there are certain types of monitoring that is either really technically difficult, just logistically speaking, or it's really expensive, or you need many years of data that you just can't acquire in time. And some of those gaps you can fill with models. We need to extrapolate from the effects of single devices to arrays, cautiously, of course, but we can work on that. And extrapolate from the effects on individual animals, for example, to that animal population in the area. Most cases, resources are not unlimited. There's time limitations, there's budget limitations. So we need to prioritize what uncertainties are being addressed and how best to use whatever monitoring resources are available. And you may be familiar from the stakeholder perspective of what's often referred to as the valley of death between the initial stages of talking about a project and actually implementing it. So somewhere during that planning process, uncertainty really lowers confidence of many stakeholders and perhaps regulators about the effects of that project. And there's many cases where projects just stall out at that stage and can't proceed, or are too expensive to pursue. So there's a very close relationship between monitoring and models. We need the monitoring data to inform the models both what form they take and the input parameters and input data for those models. And we need information from the field to compare with model predictions to see how well the models are doing as a validation. In turn, we can use the models, as I've been mentioning, to synthesize and interpret the monitoring data that we're receiving. And so this is a cycle, and in an adaptive management process or other similar approaches, these can and should occur iteratively as you develop and test devices or develop projects in the field. Instead of a one-time activity, that this is a way to continue learning and being able to evaluate and synthesize that learning. So we evaluated models at several levels. We looked at interactions between stressors and receptors, and the stressors I'll go into in more depth in a moment. Receptors include things like animals, aquatic vegetation, anything in the environment that is being affected by aspects of the marine energy devices that could create a stressor. And so for each individual interaction, we looked at what models are available, how well developed they are, how much they've been applied to marine energy already. And we looked for individual stressors and across these interactions at data needs, both for developing models and for validating, looked for commonalities. And then overall looked at similarities and approaches and ways that we can either combine multiple interactions in the same model or use the same information for multiple models. And a lot of the focus in the sort of the research field has been on individual stressor receptor interactions and not taking advantage of the ways you might be able to exploit these commonalities to use models more quickly and more effectively. So we looked at 6 categories of stressor receptor interactions. And if you're familiar with the work of, for example, the OES Environmental State of the Science report published in 2020, and some related papers and other formats, you may have seen these categories before. So they include both physical and biological effects. There's changes in the oceanographic systems, which can be changes to currents, waves, salinity, even sediment transport, and so forth. Underwater noise, that's pretty straightforward. We're looking both at, in case of tidal or wave devices, less the potential for injury and more the potential for devices changing species behavior. Electromagnetic fields, both generated potentially by the generator within a device and by the transmission cables that are leading from the device to shore. Habitat changes can affect species distribution in terms of the habitat they like to use, and also their ability to disperse between different habitat areas, for example, by settling on a device and then reproducing and dispersing to another device and so forth. Collision risk is also fairly straightforward. It includes both potential for mortality, but also injury or other sublethal effects that can affect a population. And finally, a slightly less commonly discussed one is displacement of marine animals, which is looking at behavioral responses, especially to arrays, larger arrays, that aren't responding to, say, noise or habitat change, but just avoidance of the devices themselves that might keep a animal from getting to a feeding ground or a breeding area or make their migration routes longer, for example. So we looked at these 6 interactions and we broke some of them up a little bit for this sake of discussion into biological and physical effects. So this figure on the right is from the paper and I'll be using it throughout this summary. You can see on the x-axis, this is looking at maturity of models from any context that they might be applied. So not necessarily marine energy, it could be any type of habitat model, for example, for any reason. And whether we have models that are ranging from very hypothetical, not informed by field data, to having some field data that informs them, to having really validated output. So this is not necessarily validated for marine energy, but it's validated in some settings. So we have confidence in the models in their general application. And then on the y-axis, we have the availability of actual applications to marine energy. And so in some cases, there aren't really any. And in some cases, we have multiple applications developed, in some cases more than we can detail in the paper itself. And the purple items on this figure are physical interactions, and the blue is biological interactions. So there's different levels of development for a couple of these, so we separated them. So starting with changes in oceanographic system, these are just really brief summaries of what we learned. There are many, many well-established hydrodynamic and geomorphic and wave models available, software. They are specialized to different settings. So you have some that are specialized, say, for shallow areas or deep areas or slopes. They may be specialized to complex topography and so forth. And there are quite a few theoretical studies for marine energy. Again, we couldn't even detail them all in the review without getting quite a bit longer, but they're all really theoretical. And a part of that is because most of the effects that we expect to see, say effects to a current or to the waves hitting a shore, are really from arrays of devices, and there's not really opportunities to test that in the field yet. So the greatest need for the overall development is places where we can validate these models for marine energy specifically. And they're also really important because they can provide input to other models in these categories. So for example, they may provide water velocity and water level and salinity information to a habitat or noise model. And so having an accurate model is critical for improving the accuracy of the models depending on it. For underwater noise, there are also quite a few models that have been developed. And a lot of these are developed for fields like underwater construction, boat noise, a wide variety of sort of industrial applications. And those are also adapted for different, say, frequencies of noise. You'd use specific models, or the depth of the water and the variability of the environment. And there are several that are specifically suitable for the type of noise you'd expect from the operation of, say, a tidal turbine. There is a little bit of field validation out there, but it's often from playing back sounds of devices rather than actual devices. And so that's got some limitations. And on the biological side, there's more uncertainty. People have developed frameworks for modeling the individual and population responses of species to noise. And that's especially been done for things like pile driving for the installation of offshore wind or construction and activities like those, and less so for sort of the continuous noise that might occur from tidal turbines. So there is definitely a lack of information specifically about behavioral responses and how that affects the physiology and sort of the life cycle of species. Electromagnetic fields are a sort of underdeveloped area. Obviously, the physics of basic electromagnetic fields are very well understood, but there's not really a lot of modeling for complex environments, especially, say, buried cables in the marine sediment, and that sediment changes as you move along the cable, and you need to predict the effect of that, for example. There's a little bit of field monitoring of transmission cables, not necessarily for marine energy, but just for electrical transmission underwater, buried cables. There's been a little bit of study on biological responses, but there aren't really any biological models yet. That's very early, the stage of model development. For changes in habitat, we go back to having a lot of well-developed approaches, statistical approaches, simulation approaches, food webs, et cetera. And for general applications, they're well studied, pretty well understood, but there's really very few marine energy applications for this at all. And again, there's considerations about whether you need to have arrays present to really monitor this in the field. And certainly that would benefit the studies, but I think there's also research, we think there's probably research that can be done now that can further develop these from marine energy. Collision risk is pretty specific to either marine energy or tidal energy or wind energy. So there are a few theoretical approaches, but there's not a lot, other context to borrow from, and there's just very little data about behavior and about what happens to individual animals when they get very close to a turbine. It's very hard to monitor. And so this is definitely an active area of development. There's a lot of needs both in the monitoring and modeling side to further develop these. And finally, displacement of marine animals hasn't really been considered. It's primarily relevant to larger arrays again, but the good thing is that the same framework that might be applied to, say, the effects of noise on the population can also be applied to other behavioral responses. So maybe farther away than they can hear the device, they still might avoid it, and we can consider that in a behavioral model. So overall, the implications for monitoring are that there are types of oceanographic data, physical data, especially for, say, wave climates, that are really applicable to many model types and are feed through from the oceanographic models into other models. So those are very important. Species distribution data is used in a number of models as well, and that is often location specific, but maybe you may be able to extrapolate that. In general, any type of behavioral data, even if it's not location specific, is extremely helpful at this point in development. And it's obviously, we always want to be accurate, but it's really a high priority when for accuracy when data is used at multiple levels of modeling. So I've mentioned, if you use a hydrodynamic model to inform your noise model, that any error in that hydrodynamic model is going to propagate and create more uncertainty. And so you want to be able to be as accurate as you can in those inputs. And finally, we can use even the most theoretical models to refine the kind of information that we need to collect. From the planning perspective, as modelers, what we recommend, among our recommendations, would be to have prediction in mind from the start when you're identifying what monitoring might need to be done. So either if you're planning a project or you're regulating a development in an area, to be thinking about what models might be able to use from the start saves a lot of time and potentially effort in collecting the right data that is beneficial for both performance metrics and modeling. You can identify how you can be more efficient with monitoring, what you may not need to monitor, how you can use similar data or similar approaches among different projects. It's important to understand error and estimation so that you understand when you go to compare your model predictions to the field data, some of that's natural, some of the error is natural variability and some of that's error in the model. And so if you understand the error in what you're collecting, so the confidence intervals, for example, then you can better understand how good your model is doing at predicting reality. And finally, there's always going to be uncertainty to more or less higher or lesser extent, but we can track and manage that uncertainty explicitly. And that is very helpful for regulators, for planners, for stakeholders to be able to see how that's developing over time. And finally, just to wrap up, there's many directions in which monitoring and model development is still needed. This is a very fertile area for development. And there are definitely some limitations now with, say, how much data is available, but using the modeling frameworks from the start, developing them, and making that feedback loop between modeling and monitoring is really valuable right away for being able to efficiently do research, to plan, and just to reduce uncertainty in general. So with that, we will take a pause to see if we have any questions.
And once again, if you do have a question, please just pop it into the chat and I will read it out loud for Kate. And we have one starting question. Can you give an example of how to use a model to determine information needs before collecting any data?
Right, so just to pick an example for a collision risk model in which behavior is very important for addressing uncertainties. There's some sort of very basic behavior, say for a diving bird, that people would measure, such as time spent on the surface or time spent diving or depth that they're diving. If you have a model in mind, if you know what's appropriate for the device and the general situation, and you know what the behavioral parameters that need to go into that, there is different levels of information, types of information, quality of information, and so forth, will vary by the model approach that's being used. And so you can refine exactly what you need to be looking for, whether it be, again, what exactly they're doing at those depths, their horizontal movement, are they moving with or against the current, for example. Those are ways that you can know whether you're going to be using that information in a model and how good it needs to be to answer your questions.
Great, thank you. We have another question. What do you need to consider when using an existing model in a new location?
That's a very important consideration, because obviously if you spend a lot of time developing models in one location, it would be great to be able to use that somewhere else and sort of capitalize on that investment. And it depends a lot both on the model type, of course, but the stressors that you're focusing on. But there are environmental considerations that are really important for a lot of models. And I know one example that has been studied for behavior is, I believe it was harbor porpoises, I might be wrong, but marine mammals that behave differently in open water than close to shore. And so research that might have been done for paddle driving or around operation of wind turbines offshore might not be appropriate for their behavior at, say, a tidal turbines in a strait. So behavior is a consideration, and just the physical characteristics of a location. You may need to use a different wave model, for example, or a different type of noise model if you're in a different depth, and other considerations like that. If it's a similar environment, then there may be a lot that you can use to sort of a lot of overlap in those conditions that you can take advantage of.
Okay, thank you. We are still waiting for a few more questions to come up. So once again, if you do have one that comes up, please just write it in the chat and I'll read it out loud. I'll give it a minute. It's a great time to follow up or hear some expertise from a great scientist. Okay. Well, if you do have any follow-up questions, please feel free to email tritonmre@pnnl.gov. I left that email in the chat. We check this email and we are open to new questions and we'd like to answer them and collaborate. We also have some other information for upcoming webinars. The next one you can register for. It's on April 21st. The link for the registration is also in the chat. It's with science communicator Kayleen Gunn. She does an amazing job communicating our science and helping get our research out there. So I would not miss that one. The registration link is in the chat. If you want to see any of our past webinars, you can also find them on the YouTube playlist. We only have one so far, but this one will be posted. And once again, if you missed any or you'd like to revisit one, you can find them on that YouTube playlist. It's Triton Talks. You can also take our survey. This one, it will be help us understand what we need to do, what we would like to communicate, what people would like to hear from us. So if you have about 5 minutes, it would be wonderful if you could take those. And at these registration links, you can also see the rest of the webinar series. But we want your feedback, and you can also find us at Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, any of the above. So if that's all, and we don't have any more questions, I think that wraps it up. Thank you for attending the second session of the Triton Talks webinar series. Please do take the survey, and hopefully we'll see you on April 21st for the next session. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kate.